The maid froze with blood on her fingers as the little girl gasped, and for the first time in 7 years, sound ripped through the room. The billionaire stormed in, saw what she'd done to his hidden daughter, and screamed for security. But before they could touch her, the child looked up and whispered a word that shattered everything. Was this a miracle or a crime? Before this story gets taken away from you, hit that subscribe right now. Like this video and share it with someone who believes miracles don't look like money. Because what happens next will make you question everything, and you'll want proof you were here. Make sure to tell me in the comments where you are watching from. For 7 years, the Bullock estate existed in near silence. Not the peaceful kind. The kind that presses against your chest and refuses to let you breathe. Matt Bullock had built an empire, glass towers, private jets, boardrooms that bent to his will. His name moved markets. His signature closed deals worth more than most cities earned in a year. When he spoke, Wall Street listened. When he walked into a room, conversations stopped. Not out of respect, out of fear. But inside his sprawling home, tucked away from the world behind iron gates and manicured hedges, lived the one thing he could never fix. His daughter, Julia. Julia Bullock was born deaf. The doctors explained it carefully, gently, as if soft words could soften a permanent truth. Congenital hearing loss, no detectable neurological damage, no clear cause, no cure they could promise. Matt nodded through every explanation, wrote every check they slid across the table, flew Julia across continents before she was old enough to remember airports. Nothing worked. London specialists shook their heads. Swiss clinics ran the same tests twice. A doctor in Singapore suggested prayer. Matt fired him on the spot. By the time Julia turned 7, Matt stopped trying to cure her. Not because he stopped caring, but because something worse took root. Shame. He told the press Julia was fragile. He told investors she was studying privately. He told the world nothing at all. And slowly, quietly, he hid her. The Bullock mansion sat on 12 acres of Connecticut land. From the road, you could barely see it. Trees lined the driveway like soldiers, their branches forming a canopy that blocked the sky. The house itself was Georgian, all white columns and symmetrical windows, the kind of place that looked like it belonged in a magazine. It did, once, before Julia. Now the gates stayed closed. The curtains stayed drawn. Visitors were turned away at the entrance. Staff turnover was constant. No one stayed long. The rules were simple. Keep your head down, do your job, don't ask questions. And whatever you do, don't get attached to the girl. Julia lived inside that house like a ghost, educated by private tutors who came and left without speaking, entertained by toys that made no sound, watched over by nannies who treated her like fine china. Beautiful, breakable, better left untouched. Matt loved her deeply, fiercely, but every time he looked at her, he saw failure. A reminder that even with all his money, all his power, all his control over every other aspect of his life, he had lost here. So he built walls. Not just around the property, around his heart, and silence became one of them. He stopped hosting dinners, stopped attending galas unless business demanded it, stopped pretending he was whole. His friends, if you could call them that, whispered behind his back. Poor Matt. Lost his wife. Got stuck with a broken kid. Some men have all the luck. He heard them. He always heard them. But he never corrected them. Because correcting them would mean admitting Julia existed. And admitting Julia existed would mean admitting he'd failed her. The house ran on a schedule. Breakfast at 7, lessons at 9, lunch at noon, more lessons, dinner at 6, bed by 8. Every day, the same routine, the same silence, the same suffocating weight pressing down on everyone who lived there. Julia never complained. She sat through her lessons with perfect posture, her small hands folded in her lap, her green eyes tracking her tutor's lips with mechanical precision. She colored quietly in the afternoons. She ate her meals without a sound. She went to bed when she was told. But sometimes, late at night, Matt would stand outside her door and watch her through the crack. She would be sitting on the floor, her back against the bed, her fingers pressed against the wooden floorboards, waiting, listening, not with her ears, but with her body, for vibrations, for signs of life, for proof that she wasn't alone. Matt never went inside. He told himself it was because she was sleeping. But the truth was darker. He was terrified of what he'd see in her eyes if she looked at him. The staff knew better than to interfere. Mrs. Caldwell, the head housekeeper, had been with the family for 4 years, longer than anyone else. She was a tall, severe woman, with gray hair pulled tight against her skull and a mouth that looked like it had forgotten how to smile. She ran the house like a prison warden. "Mr. Bullock values discretion," she told every new hire. "The girl is not your concern. You clean, you cook, you leave. If you have questions, you don't ask them. If you notice something, you forget it. Are we clear?" Most nodded. A few tried to argue. They didn't last. The longest anyone had stayed besides Mrs. Caldwell was 6 months. The shortest was 3 days. The girl creeped them out, they said. The silence was unbearable. The father was impossible. So, when the agency called Mrs. Caldwell about a new applicant, a woman named Benedicta Shalom, she barely looked at the resume. "Can she start Monday?" "She's inexperienced," the agent hesitated. "Her references are thin. Her English is, can she start Monday?" "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Tell her to be here at 7. Mrs. Caldwell hung up the phone and crossed another name off her list. They never stayed, but they always came. That was the house Shalom walked into. Benedicta Shalom arrived on a rainy Thursday morning, 3 days earlier than scheduled, clutching a worn handbag and a folded letter from the agency that had nearly rejected her. She wasn't supposed to be here. Her accent was too thick, her resume too thin. Her last employer had let her go without explanation, but the Bullocks needed someone quiet, obedient, invisible. Shalom had mastered all three. She had not mastered indifference. Mrs. Caldwell met her at the service entrance, eyes narrowing as she took in Shalom's cheap coat and scuffed shoes. "You're early." "Yes, ma'am." Shalom's voice was soft, careful. "I thought, don't think, follow." The tour lasted 10 minutes. Kitchen, laundry, supply closet, east wing off-limits. Second floor off-limits unless specifically instructed. Mr. Bullock's study, absolutely off-limits. "And the girl?" Shalom asked quietly. Mrs. Caldwell stopped walking. "What about her?" "Where does she—" "You don't go near the girl unless I tell you to. You don't speak to her. You don't touch her. You don't even look at her unless absolutely necessary. Do you understand?" Shalom nodded slowly, but her eyes said something else. On her first day, she noticed Julia. The girl sat perfectly still in the sitting room, hands folded in her lap, eyes following vibrations rather than sounds. A clock ticked on the mantel. Julia's head turned slightly toward it, not hearing, sensing. When the door slammed in another wing of the house, Julia looked up instantly, not startled, just aware. And when Shalom passed behind her, carrying a tray of untouched breakfast, Julia turned, sensing her presence before seeing her. Shalom froze, not because the child was deaf, but because the child was listening in a way no one else in that house was. Julia's eyes met hers, big, green, searching. For just a moment, neither of them moved. Then Julia did something that made Shalom's breath catch. She smiled, small, tentative, like she'd forgotten how. Shalom smiled back, and in that moment, in that house, built on silence and shame, something shifted. Julia reached up slowly, absently, and touched behind her right ear. Not scratching, not adjusting, pressing, like something hurt. Shalom's smile faded. Her eyes narrowed. She'd seen that gesture before, years ago, in another house, another child. "Don't get attached," Mrs. Caldwell's voice cut through the room like a blade. "I told you." Shalom turned, nodded, and walked away. But that night, alone in her small room above the kitchen, she couldn't stop thinking about the way Julia had touched her ear, the way her small fingers had pressed, lingered, winced, and the way no one, not the tutors, not the nannies, not the billionaire father who claimed to love her, had noticed. Shalom knelt beside her bed and prayed, not for courage, not yet, for clarity, because something was wrong in that house. And it wasn't the silence. It was what the silence was hiding. Benedicta Shalom had learned to survive on prayers and pennies. The prayers came easy. She'd been raised in a small church in Lagos, where her grandmother had taught her that faith wasn't about what you had. It was about what you held on to when everything else was taken away. The pennies were harder. She'd come to America 6 years ago with a work visa, a borrowed suitcase, and a promise to send money home every month. Her younger sister needed school fees, her grandmother needed medication. Her mother's grave needed a proper headstone. Shalom had kept every promise except the last one. She told herself she'd get to it, when she had more, when things were stable. But stability was a luxury she'd never tasted. She'd worked in nursing homes, hotels, private residences, good jobs, honest jobs. But something always happened. A manager who didn't like her accent. A family who decided they wanted someone more local. An elderly patient who passed away, and suddenly her position was eliminated. She never stayed anywhere long enough to save. And then there was the thing she didn't talk about. The thing that woke her at 3 a.m, heart pounding, hands shaking. Samuel. He'd been 4 years old. The grandson of Mrs. Chen, a woman Shalom had cared for in Queens. Sweet boy. Quiet. Always tugging at his left ear. "He's fine," Mrs. Chen had said. "Just fussy." Shalom had believed her. She'd been new to the country then, unsure of herself, afraid to overstep. 3 weeks later, Samuel was in the hospital. Ear infection, untreated, spread to the bone. He survived, barely, but Shalom never forgave herself. She'd seen the signs, the tugging, the wincing, the way Samuel tilted his head when people spoke to him, and she'd said nothing. That's why, when the agency called about the Bullock position, she almost said no. Private estate, the agent had explained. Live-in, wealthy family. They need someone discreet. What kind of family? A pause. the kind that values privacy. Is there a child? Another pause. Longer this time. Yes, but you won't be caring for her. Just housekeeping. Can you start Monday? Shalom should have asked more questions, but her rent was 3 weeks overdue, and her sister's tuition was due in 5 days. So she said yes. The interview had been worse than she'd expected. Mrs. Caldwell had looked at her like she was inspecting spoiled meat. Your last employer. Why did you leave? The family moved. Your English is adequate. Barely. Shalom said nothing. Mr. Bullock demands perfection. If you break something, you pay for it. If you speak out of turn, you're dismissed. If you interfere with the child, you're not only dismissed, you're blacklisted from every agency in the state. I understand. Do you? Mrs. Caldwell leaned forward. Because girls like you come here thinking they can make a difference, thinking they can fix things. You can't. This family doesn't need fixing. It needs silence. Are we clear? Shalom met her eyes. Yes, ma'am. But inside, something coiled tight in her chest. Girls like you. She'd heard that phrase her entire life. Girls like you don't belong here. Girls like you should be grateful. Girls like you don't get second chances. Shalom had stopped correcting people years ago, but she'd never stopped proving them wrong. The first 3 days passed in a blur of bleach, laundry, and loneliness. Shalom woke before dawn, dressed in the plain black uniform Mrs. Caldwell had provided, and moved through the house like a shadow. She cleaned rooms no one used, polished silverware no one touched, prepared meals that went half-eaten. The other staff barely acknowledged her. A cook who grunted instructions, a gardener who never came inside, a driver who spent most of his time in the garage, and Mrs. Caldwell, always watching, always waiting for Shalom to slip up. But Shalom didn't slip. She kept her head down, did her work, asked no questions, except for the ones she couldn't stop asking herself. Where was the child? She'd seen Julia only twice in those first 3 days. Once in the sitting room, coloring silently, once on the staircase, holding a tutor's hand, moving like a small prisoner being escorted between cells. Both times, Julia had looked at Shalom, not the way children usually looked at adults, not curiosity or fear or excitement, recognition, like Julia saw something in Shalom that no one else did. On the 4th morning, everything changed. Mrs. Caldwell was gone, some errand in town, and the tutor had called in sick. Julia sat alone in the conservatory, a large room filled with plants no one watered and furniture no one used. Shalom was dusting the shelves when she heard it. Not a sound. Julia couldn't make sound, not the kind that carried, but a presence. She turned. Julia stood 3 feet away, watching her with those impossibly green eyes. Shalom's breath caught. She glanced toward the hallway. Empty. Slowly, carefully, she knelt. Julia didn't move, didn't smile. Just watched. Shalom lifted her hand and waved gently. Julia's face softened. She waved back, hesitant, like she'd forgotten the gesture existed. Then Shalom did something she'd been taught at her grandmother's church, something she'd learned when the congregation had welcomed a deaf family years ago. She pressed her hand to her chest, then extended it toward Julia. Hello? Julia's eyes widened, her mouth parted slightly. Then, slowly, so slowly it made Shalom's heart ache, Julia pressed her own small hand to her chest and extended it forward. Hello? They stayed like that for a long moment. 2 people speaking a language no one else in that house understood. Then Julia did something unexpected. She reached up and touched behind her right ear. Her face tightened. Not much. Just enough. Shalom's stomach dropped. She'd seen that gesture before. Samuel. Same spot. Same expression. Without thinking, Shalom pointed to Julia's ear, then tilted her head in a question. "Does it hurt?" Julia hesitated, then nodded. "Once? Quick!" like she was confessing a crime. Before Shalom could respond, footsteps echoed in the hallway. Julia's expression snapped back to neutral. She turned and walked away, her small shoulders rigid, her hands clasped behind her back. By the time Mrs. Caldwell appeared in the doorway, Shalom was dusting again. "The conservatory is finished?" "Almost, ma'am." Mrs. Caldwell's eyes narrowed. "I saw the girl in here." "Yes, ma'am." "Did she bother you?" Shalom kept her voice level. "No, ma'am. She was very quiet." Mrs. Caldwell studied her for a long moment. Then she turned and left. But Shalom's hands were shaking. That night, she knelt beside her bed and prayed longer than usual. Not for guidance this time, for permission, because she knew what Mrs. Caldwell would say, what Matt Bullock would say, what everyone in that house would say. Don't interfere. It's not your place. You're just the help. But Shalom had been just the help before, and a child had nearly died because she'd stayed silent. She couldn't do that again, not even for a job she desperately needed. The next morning, Shalom found herself assigned to Julia's wing. "She needs her room tidied," Mrs. Caldwell said curtly. "Be quick. Don't touch anything unnecessary." Shalom nodded and climbed the stairs. Julia's room was smaller than she'd expected. Clean, organized, soulless. Toys lined the shelves, but they looked untouched. Books sat in perfect rows. The bed was made with military precision. It wasn't a child's room. It was a display. Julia sat at a small desk by the window, working through a mathematics worksheet. She didn't turn when Shalom entered. Shalom worked quietly, changing the linens, emptying the small wastebasket, straightening the already straight books. Then she saw it. Julia had turned her head slightly, adjusting her position in the chair, and for just a moment, just a fraction of a second, the afternoon light hit her face at the perfect angle. Shalom's hands stilled on the bedsheet. There, just inside Julia's right ear canal. Something dark. Not deep, but not normal. Julia shifted again, and the shadow disappeared. But Shalom had seen it. She stood frozen, her mind racing back to Samuel, to the infection that had nearly killed him, to the way the doctors had explained it. If someone had noticed earlier, this could have been prevented. Shalom's hands began to shake again. Julia turned then, sensing her presence, and their eyes met. The girl's face was calm, practiced, empty, but her hand drifted upward, unconsciously, toward her ear. Shalom swallowed hard. She finished making the bed in silence, gathered her supplies, and left the room. But she knew two things with absolute certainty. Something was wrong with Julia's ear, and no one in this house was looking closely enough to see it. Julia Bullock's day began the same way it had begun for 7 years. At 6:47 a.m., her internal clock woke her. Not an alarm. There was no point in alarms. Just the pressure of routine, the weight of expectation, the knowledge that deviation meant punishment. Not the loud kind. Her father never yelled. The quiet kind. Disappointment. Withdrawal. The turning away of his eyes. She dressed herself. Navy blue dress, white tights, black shoes polished the night before. Hair brushed exactly 100 strokes and tied back with a ribbon. Face washed. teeth brushed, bed made with hospital corners. By 7:15, she was downstairs. Breakfast was always the same: oatmeal, sliced fruit, orange juice in a crystal glass that seemed too heavy for her small hands. She ate alone. Her father took breakfast in his study. The staff ate in the kitchen. And Julia sat at the long dining table, one small girl in a room built for 20, chewing methodically, counting each bite the way her first nanny had taught her. 30 chews per mouthful. Proper digestion. Proper behavior. Proper everything. She'd stopped wondering why she ate alone years ago. At 8:00, Miss Hartley arrived. The tutor was a brittle woman in her 50s with thin lips and cold hands. She'd been with Julia longer than anyone else, 2 years, a record, because she'd learned the most important rule. Don't treat the girl like a child. Treat her like a project. Mathematics from 8:00 to 9:30. Reading comprehension from 9:30 to 11:00, 15-minute break. Science until lunch. Miss Hartley's lips moved carefully, forming each word with exaggerated precision. Julia watched, absorbed, responded with written answers on the tablet in front of her. She never made mistakes. Mistakes meant longer lessons. Longer lessons meant less time alone. And alone was the only time Julia could breathe. But even Miss Hartley had noticed something lately. Julia's right hand kept drifting upward, touching behind her ear, pressing, wincing. "Stop fidgeting," Miss Hartley would say, her lips sharp and clear. Julia would drop her hand, force it still. But the ache never stopped. Lunch was at noon. Always. Grilled chicken, steamed vegetables, no salt, no sauce. Food that had no flavor, no joy, no memory attached to it. Julia ate alone again. Afterward came the worst part of the day. Free time. That's what her father called it. Time for Julia to play, to explore, to be a child. But there was nothing free about it. She was given toys, expensive ones, educational ones, wooden blocks that taught geometry, puzzles that taught spatial reasoning, books with pictures but no words she could hear in her mind. Everything in that house was silent. The television was never on, no music played, no laughter echoed through the halls, just silence. And Julia, sitting in the middle of it, building towers and knocking them down over and over, watching them fall, because at least falling made vibrations she could feel. At 2:15, Miss Hartley returned. More lessons. History, geography, art appreciation without the art, just images on a screen and explanations Julia had to memorize. By 5:00, Miss Hartley was gone, and Julia was alone again. Dinner at 6:00. Same table, same silence, same ritual. Her father joined her sometimes, not often, maybe once a week. He would sit at the opposite end of the table, 20 feet away, and eat without looking at her. His jaw would work mechanically. His eyes would stay fixed on his plate, or his phone, or the window, anywhere but her face. When he did look, it was quick, clinical, like he was checking to make sure she was still breathing. Then he'd look away again. Julia used to try to get his attention. She'd wave, smile, tap the table in patterns, hoping he'd notice. He never did. So she stopped trying. Now she just ate, counted her bites, waited for permission to leave. By 8:00, she was in bed. Lights out. Door closed. Darkness. That's when the loneliness became unbearable. Because, in the dark, Julia couldn't lip read, couldn't watch for vibrations, couldn't pretend she was less alone than she was. In the dark, There was only her and the ache behind her right ear, and the question she'd been asking herself since she was old enough to think. Why doesn't he love me? She knew he did. Somewhere deep down, beneath the shame and the silence and the distance, she knew. But knowing didn't make it hurt less. Matt Bullock had not always been this way. When Julia was born, he'd held her like she was made of light. His wife, Catherine, beautiful Catherine, had died during delivery. Hemorrhage, too much blood, not enough time. Matt had been holding Catherine's hand when the monitors flatlined. And then, minutes later, a nurse had placed Julia in his arms. "She's healthy," the nurse had whispered. "She's perfect." Matt had looked down at his daughter's face and felt something crack inside him. Catherine was gone. But this child, this tiny, fragile, perfect child, was here. For the first 6 months, Matt barely slept. He fed Julia himself, changed her, rocked her through the nights. He hired the best nannies, the best pediatricians, the best of everything. He was going to give her the world. And then, during a routine checkup, the doctor had said the words that changed everything. "She's not responding to sound." More tests, more doctors, more words Matt didn't want to hear. Congenital, irreversible, profound, deaf. His daughter was deaf. Matt had thrown himself into fixing it. Specialists in London, experimental treatments in Switzerland, cochlear implant consultations that led nowhere. Every door closed, every hope crushed. And somewhere along the way, Matt's love curdled into something darker. He looked at Julia and saw failure. He looked at Julia and saw the daughter Catherine would never know. He looked at Julia and saw proof that even infinite money couldn't buy perfection. So he stopped looking. He told himself it was for her protection. The world was cruel. People would stare, judge, pity. Better to keep her safe, hidden, home. But the truth was simpler and uglier. He was ashamed. And every time he saw Julia, the shame grew heavier. So he buried himself in work. Deals, acquisitions, mergers, things he could control. And Julia became a ghost in his own house. Shalom saw all of it. She watched Julia eat alone, watched her build towers in silence, watched her drift through that massive house like she was apologizing for existing. And it broke something in Shalom she thought had already been broken. She started small, a smile when she passed Julia in the hallway, a gentle wave when their eyes met. Then, when Mrs. Caldwell was occupied elsewhere, something more. She'd kneel beside Julia during free time and teach her simple signs. Not formal ASL, Shalom didn't know enough. Just gestures, comfort, connection. Thank you. A hand to the chin moving forward. I see you. 2 fingers pointing to her own eyes, then to Julia. You're not alone. Hands clasped together, then opened. Julia absorbed every gesture like she was starving. Her face, usually so controlled, so empty, would light up. Her hands would move eagerly, clumsily, trying to copy. Getting frustrated when she couldn't. Trying again. And every time Shalom left, Julia would watch her go with an expression that made Shalom's chest ache. Don't leave. But Shalom always had to leave. The staff noticed. The cook stopped talking when Shalom entered the kitchen. The driver watched her with narrowed eyes, and Mrs. Caldwell's warnings grew sharper. You're overstepping. You're not here to befriend the child. You're here to clean. Do your job. But how could she? How could she mop floors, and dust shelves and pretend not to see Julia's loneliness, her pain, her desperate hunger for connection. One evening, while Matt was away on business, Shalom found Julia in the conservatory. The girl was sitting on the floor, her back against the wall, her arms wrapped around her knees, crying. Not loud. Julia's cries were almost silent, just hitching breaths and tears streaming down her face. Shalom's heart shattered. She crossed the room and knelt beside Julia. The girl looked up, startled, ashamed. She wiped her face quickly. Shalom shook her head gently. She placed her hand over her heart, then reached out and touched Julia's heart. "I feel it too." Julia's face crumpled. She leaned forward, and Shalom wrapped her arms around the small, shaking body. They stayed like that for a long time. When Julia finally pulled back, her face was red, her eyes swollen. She lifted her hand and pointed to her right ear. Then she made a gesture Shalom had taught her days ago. Hurt. But she didn't stop there. Julia's small hands moved again, slower this time, deliberate. She pointed to her ear, made the sign for hurt, then swept her hand in a circle. Always. Shalom's blood went cold. Julia was trying to tell her something. Her ear didn't just hurt sometimes. It hurt all the time. Mrs. Caldwell was waiting when Shalom left the conservatory. The housekeeper stood in the hallway like a sentinel, arms crossed, face carved from stone. "My office. Now." Shalom's stomach dropped, but she nodded and followed. Mrs. Caldwell's office was small, windowless, oppressive. Filing cabinets lined the walls. A single lamp cast harsh shadows across the desk. The door closed with a click that sounded like a lock. "Sit." Shalom sat. Mrs. Caldwell remained standing, looming. "How long have you been with us, Mrs. Shalom?" "2 weeks, ma'am." 2 weeks." Mrs. Caldwell's lips thinned. "And in 2 weeks, you've managed to violate the most important rule of this household." Don't lie to me. I saw you in the conservatory, holding the girl, touching her. She was crying." "She's always crying." Mrs. Caldwell's voice cracked like a whip. "Do you think you're the first person to notice? Do you think you're special? That you're going to save her?" Shalom said nothing. "You're not. You're just the help, and the help does not interfere with Mr. Bullock's daughter. Ever. She's in pain. She's deaf. She's been examined by the best doctors money can buy. There is nothing wrong with her except the thing that cannot be fixed. But her ear is not your concern." Mrs. Caldwell leaned forward, her voice dropping to something dangerous. "Let me make this very clear. You are here because you were cheap and desperate. You have no credentials, no references that matter, no legal recourse if I decide to terminate you today." The words landed like stones. "There are a dozen women who would take this job tomorrow. Women who understand boundaries. Women who know their place." Shalom's hands clenched in her lap. "So here's what's going to happen," Mrs. Caldwell continued. "You're going to stay away from the girl. You're going to do your job. And if I catch you touching her, speaking to her, or even looking at her wrong, you're not just fired. I'll make sure you never work in this city again." Silence filled the room. "Do we understand each other?" Shalom met the woman's eyes. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. You're dismissed." Shalom stood, walked to the door, and paused. "Ma'am?" "What?" "If something's wrong with Julia, really wrong, and everyone keeps ignoring it, who's responsible when she suffers?" Mrs. Caldwell's face hardened. "Get out." That night, Shalom couldn't sleep. She lay in her narrow bed, staring at the ceiling, Mrs. Caldwell's words echoing in her mind. Cheap, desperate, no recourse. All true. If she lost this job, she'd lose everything. Her visa status was tied to employment. Her sister's tuition was due in 3 days. Her grandmother's nursing home wouldn't wait another month. She should stay quiet, keep her head down, survive. But every time she closed her eyes, she saw Julia's face, the way the girl had pointed to her ear, the way she'd signed, always. And then, worse, she saw another face, Samuel, 4 years old, tugging at his ear, crying through the night. "He's just fussy," Mrs. Chen had said. And Shalom, young, uncertain, afraid to overstep, had believed her, until the ambulance came, until she'd watched Samuel carried out on a stretcher, his tiny body burning with fever, his ear swollen and weeping. The doctors had been blunt. Another few days, and the infection would have reached his brain. He could have died. Mrs. Chen had fired Shalom the next day, not for failing to notice, but for noticing too late. Shalom had sworn then she'd never make that mistake again. She'd sworn she'd speak up, speak louder, refuse to be silenced. But here she was, silent again, terrified again. She reached for her phone, the one luxury she owned, and opened the browser. Typed, "Ear pain, deaf children." Scrolled, "Ear infections in hearing-impaired children often go unnoticed." Obstruction can mimic deafness symptoms. Chronic pain may not present with visible external signs. She read for hours, medical journals, parent forums, case studies, and with every page, the knot in her stomach tightened. Julia's symptoms matched dozens of conditions that had nothing to do with congenital deafness, but they all required the same thing: someone who cared enough to look. The next morning, Shalom worked in silence. She scrubbed floors, changed linens, stayed away from Julia. But she watched. She saw the way Julia pressed behind her ear during breakfast, the way the girl's face tightened when she turned her head too quickly, the way she'd started holding herself differently, rigid, guarded, like movement hurt. Miss Hartley noticed, too. "She's distracted today," the tutor muttered to Mrs. Caldwell in the hallway. "Keeps touching her head." "Children fidget," Mrs. Caldwell said dismissively. "Continue the lesson." Shalom bit her tongue so hard she tasted blood. That afternoon, Matt Bullock came home early. It was rare. He usually stayed at the office until after Julia was asleep. But today, he was home by 4, his suit jacket slung over his shoulder, his tie loosened. He found Julia in the sitting room, curled in a chair, her hand pressed against her ear. Shalom was dusting nearby, close enough to see, too far to intervene. Matt knelt in front of his daughter. His lips moved slowly. "Does it hurt?" Julia nodded. Matt's jaw tightened. He reached out, gently pulled her hand away from her ear, and examined it briefly. Then he stood. "It's normal," he said to no one in particular. "She's always been sensitive." He walked away. Just like that. Shalom's hands stilled on the bookshelf. She watched Matt disappear into his study, watched the door close, watched Julia curl tighter into herself. And something inside Shalom snapped. She crossed the room before she could stop herself, knelt beside Julia's chair. The girl looked up, startled. Shalom pointed to Julia's ear, then made a questioning gesture. Julia hesitated, then nodded. Her eyes filled with tears. Shalom's chest ached. She wanted to scoop this child up, carry her to a hospital, demand that someone, anyone, actually help her. But she couldn't. She had no authority, no rights, no voice that mattered. She was just the help. Julia's hand had drifted upward again, pressing behind her ear. And then something changed. The girl's face went white. Her eyes widened. Her mouth opened in a silent gasp. Shalom's heart stopped. "Julia?" The girl didn't respond, couldn't respond. Her small body went rigid, then slack. And then, slowly, terribly, Julia slumped forward. Shalom caught her before she hit the floor. "Julia!" She patted the girl's face, felt for a pulse. It was there, fast, thready. "Julia, stay with me." The girl's eyes were half open, unfocused. Her hand still pressed against her ear. Shalom's training kicked in. She laid Julia on the floor, elevated her legs slightly, checked her breathing. Stable, but barely. She ran to the hallway and screamed. "Help! Someone help!" Footsteps thundered. Mrs. Caldwell appeared first, then the cook, then Matt. He shoved past everyone, dropped to his knees beside his daughter. "What happened?" His voice was raw, terrified. "She collapsed," Shalom said. "Sir, her ear, something's wrong with her ear." "Call 911, Matt barked at Mrs. Caldwell. The housekeeper fumbled for her phone. Matt gathered Julia into his arms, his face drained of color. "Daddy's here," he whispered, even though she couldn't hear him. "Daddy's here." Julia's eyes fluttered, focused briefly on her father's face, then closed again, and in that moment, with his daughter limp in his arms, with the house erupting into chaos around him, Matt Bullock finally looked at Shalom, really looked at her. "You," he said. "What do you know?" Shalom's mouth went dry. This was it. The moment she'd lose everything. But Julia's face flashed in her mind. Samuel's face. Every child she'd ever failed or saved. "I think," she said slowly, "there's something in her ear that shouldn't be there." Matt stared at her. "And I think it's been there a very long time." The ambulance arrived in 12 minutes. 12 minutes that felt like 12 hours. Shalom stood against the wall while paramedics swarmed Julia, checking vitals, asking questions Matt couldn't answer. Has she had seizures before? No. Any recent head trauma? No. Medical conditions we should know about? Matt's voice cracked. She's deaf. The paramedic paused. Congenital? Yes. They loaded Julia onto the stretcher. She was awake now. Groggy, confused. Her eyes searched the room until they found Shalom. The girl's hand lifted weakly. "Don't leave." But Shalom couldn't follow. Wasn't allowed to follow. Matt climbed into the ambulance without looking back. And just like that, they were gone. The house exhaled into silence. Mrs. Caldwell turned to Shalom, her face unreadable. "Your shift is over." Shalom's voice was hollow. "Will she be okay?" "That's not your concern. Go to your room." Shalom went, but she didn't sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed, phone clutched in her hands, waiting for news that wouldn't come. At 2:00 a.m., she heard the front door open. Footsteps in the foyer. Heavy, exhausted. Matt was home. Shalom crept to her door, pressed her ear against it. Voices below. Matt and Mrs. Caldwell. What did they say? Inconclusive. Matt's voice was ragged. They ran tests, scans, found nothing. They think it was stress, anxiety. They want to refer us to a psychologist. And Julia? Sleeping. They gave her something to calm her down. A pause. The maid, Mrs. Caldwell said carefully. She was out of line today. She was the only one who noticed my daughter was collapsing. Another pause. Longer. She's become too involved, Mr. Bullock. It's not appropriate. Then maybe, Matt said slowly, we've been inappropriate. Silence. I want her at the hospital tomorrow, 6 a.m. She can sit with Julia while they run more tests. Mrs. Caldwell's voice turned cold. Sir, I don't care what you think. Julia responds to her. And right now, that's all that matters. Footsteps retreated. Shalom sank to the floor, heart pounding. Tomorrow, 6 a.m. She had to be ready. The hospital room was pale green and smelled like disinfectant. Julia lay in the bed, small and fragile beneath white sheets, an IV taped to her arm. Her eyes were open when Shalom entered. Matt stood near the window, phone pressed to his ear, arguing with someone about quarterly projections. Shalom crossed to Julia's bedside and knelt. The girl's face brightened slightly. She lifted her hand in greeting. Hello? Shalom returned the gesture, then pointed to Julia's chest, tilted her head. How are you? Julia's expression crumpled. Her hand moved to her ear, still bandaged from the examination, then dropped. She looked at her father's back, then at Shalom, then down at her hands. Slowly, deliberately, she began to sign. The gestures were rough, unpracticed, but Shalom understood. No more doctors. Shalom's throat tightened. She shook her head gently, tried to sign reassurance. They're trying to help. Julia's eyes filled with tears. She signed again, more emphatically. They don't listen. And Shalom realized, with devastating clarity, that Julia was right. The doctors had run their tests, found nothing, labeled her anxious, difficult, just like they'd labeled Samuel. Just like they'd labeled dozens of children Shalom had read about last night. Children whose pain was dismissed because it didn't fit the diagnosis someone had already decided was correct. She reached out and took Julia's hand. The girl squeezed back desperately. Over the next 3 days, the hospital found nothing. No infection, no tumor, no structural abnormality. It's psychosomatic, one doctor suggested, common in children with disabilities who feel isolated. Matt had looked ready to throw the man through a window. They went home on Thursday. Julia returned to her routine. Lessons, silence, loneliness. But something had changed. She watched Shalom constantly now, not just with curiosity, with hope, like Shalom was the only person in the world who saw her as something other than broken. And Shalom felt that hope like a weight pressing on her chest, because she didn't know what to do with it. That night, alone in her room, Shalom opened her phone again. She scrolled through articles she'd already read a dozen times, stopped on one. Case study, 7-year-old with misdiagnosed hearing loss. She'd read it before, but this time something clicked. The child in the study had been deaf for years. Doctors had assumed congenital loss, but a routine examination by a school nurse had revealed a foreign object lodged deep in the ear canal, so deep that standard examinations had missed it. Removal had been delicate, dangerous, but successful. And the child's hearing had partially returned. Shalom stared at the screen until her eyes burned. She thought about the darkness she'd seen in Julia's ear, about the way Julia touched it, pressed it, winced, about the way every doctor had looked at Julia's file, seen congenital deafness, and stopped looking deeper. What if they were all wrong? What if something was there, something small, something hidden, and no one had looked closely enough to see it. Her hands began to shake. If she was right, Julia needed help immediately. If she was wrong, she'd lose everything. And if she did nothing, Samuel's face flashed in her mind. She closed her eyes and prayed. Not for courage this time, for clarity, for wisdom, for God to show her what to do. The answer came not in words, but in a feeling, a certainty, deep in her bones. She couldn't wait for doctors who wouldn't listen. She couldn't wait for Matt to believe her. If Julia was going to be saved, Shalom would have to save her herself. The decision settled over her like a shroud. Friday morning, Matt left for Boston. Emergency board meeting, 2 days minimum. Mrs. Caldwell is in charge, he told the staff. If anything happens with Julia, call me immediately. He glanced at Shalom briefly. Thank you for staying with her at the hospital. Then he was gone. The house felt emptier without him, darker. Mrs. Caldwell watched Shalom like a hawk, but Shalom had learned patience. She did her work, kept her head down, waited. That evening, after dinner, after Julia had been put to bed, Shalom returned to her room. She pulled out the small bag she'd hidden under her bed. Inside, cotton swabs, rubbing alcohol, a pen light she'd bought at the pharmacy, tweezers sterilized in boiling water. Not medical equipment, not proper tools, but it was all she had. She stared at the supplies, her heart hammering. This was insane, dangerous, possibly criminal, but doing nothing felt worse. She knelt beside her bed and prayed one last time. God, if this is wrong, stop me. Please, stop me. She waited for a sign, for doubt, for fear to paralyze her. But all she felt was Julia's small hand in hers. All she heard was the girl's silent plea. No more doctors. Shalom stood. Tomorrow, when Mrs. Caldwell was out, when the house was quiet, tomorrow she would look inside Julia's ear herself. And whatever she found, God help them both. The next morning began like any other. Breakfast, lessons, silence. Mrs. Caldwell left at noon for her weekly errands. Miss Hartley departed at 2. The house emptied until only Shalom, Julia, and the oppressive quiet remained. Shalom found Julia in the conservatory, sitting in her usual spot, staring at nothing. She knelt beside the girl. Julia looked up, surprised, then pleased. Shalom's hands trembled as she signed. I need to look at your ear. Will you trust me? Julia's expression shifted, uncertain, frightened. But then, slowly, she nodded. Shalom led her to the library where the light was best. She positioned Julia near the window, tilted her head gently. This might hurt, Shalom whispered, even though Julia couldn't hear. I'm so sorry. She clicked on the pen light, leaned close, and looked. At first, she saw nothing, just the normal curves of Julia's ear canal. Then she adjusted the angle, and there it was. Something dark, deep, wedged against the canal wall, not wax, not natural, foreign. Shalom's breath caught. She'd been right, but seeing it and removing it were two different things. Her hands shook as she reached for the tweezers. Julia's body went rigid. It's okay, Shalom whispered. I'm right here. She steadied her hand, took a breath, and reached inside. The tweezers touched something solid. Julia flinched. Shalom froze. I'm sorry, baby. I'm sorry. She tried again, gentler this time. The object shifted. Julia's hands clenched into fists. Shalom's vision blurred with tears, but she didn't stop. One more pull. Careful. Steady. The object came free, and Julia's body went rigid. Her mouth opened, and for the first time in 7 years, sound came out. Not words. A scream. Raw, loud, piercing. The sound of a child hearing her own voice for the very first time. Julia's scream tore through the silence like a wound opening. She clapped her hands over her ears, eyes wide with terror. Mouth still open in that raw, primal sound. "Julia!" Shalom dropped the tweezers, reached for her. "It's okay. You're okay." But Julia couldn't hear her reassurance. She could only hear everything else. The grandfather clock ticking in the corner. The wind rattling the windows. The blood rushing in her own ears. Her breathing loud. So loud. How was it so loud? 7 years of silence crashing down all at once. Julia's legs gave out. Shalom caught her, held her close, felt the girl's small body trembling violently. "Shh," Shalom whispered, rocking her gently. I know it's scary, but you're safe. You're safe." Julia's hands pressed harder against her ears, trying to block it out, trying to make it stop. But it wouldn't stop, because for the first time in her life, Julia Bullock could hear. Shalom's heart hammered. She looked at her hand, at the tweezers she'd dropped, and at the object lying on the white cloth beside them. Small, dark, irregular. A bead, a decorative bead, the kind you'd find on a child's toy or necklace. Wedged so deep, it had pressed against Julia's eardrum for years, causing pain, causing pressure, blocking sound. All this time, all this suffering, because of something so small. Shalom's vision blurred with tears. "Look," she whispered, even though Julia probably couldn't understand yet. She held up the bead. "Look what was hurting you." Julia's hands slowly lowered from her ears. She stared at the bead, then at Shalom, then at her own shaking hands. Her mouth moved, testing, feeling the vibration. "Ah," she breathed, and burst into tears. Not silent tears this time. Loud, gasping sobs that filled the entire room. Shalom pulled her close again. Let her cry, let her feel, let her be overwhelmed by the terrifying, beautiful gift of sound. "You're doing so good," Shalom murmured. So good." Julia's crying began to slow. She pulled back, looked at Shalom's face, watched her lips move, and understanding dawned in those green eyes. "You," Julia whispered. The word was rough, unpracticed, but clear. Shalom's breath caught. "Yes, me. You hear me? I hear you, baby. I hear you." Julia's face crumpled again, but this time, through the tears, she smiled. She opened her mouth to say something else, and the library door exploded open. Matt Bullock stood in the doorway, suit wrinkled, tie gone, hair disheveled. He'd come home early. His eyes swept the scene. Julia on the floor. Shalom holding her. Blood, just a few drops, on the white cloth. Medical supplies scattered across the table. "What the hell is happening?" His voice was thunder. Julia flinched at the sound, actually flinched, hearing it, and buried her face in Shalom's shoulder. Matt crossed the room in 3 strides. "Get away from my daughter! Sir, please, get away from her!" He grabbed Julia, pulled her away from Shalom. Julia's hands flew to her ears again. She made a sound, distressed, confused. Matt froze. His eyes widened. "Did she—" His voice cracked. "Did she just—" "Daddy?" Julia whispered. The word hung in the air like a miracle. Matt's face drained of all color. "What did you do?" He looked at Shalom, then at the supplies, then at the tiny bead on the cloth. "What the hell did you do?" "There was something in her ear," Shalom said quickly. "An obstruction. I removed it." "She can hear now." "You removed it?" Matt's voice climbed. "You're not a doctor. You had no right. She was in pain. You could have killed her." He pulled Julia closer, his hands shaking. "You could have ruptured her eardrum, caused an infection, permanent damage." Julia whimpered at the raised voices. Matt immediately lowered his voice, but his fury remained. "Mrs. Caldwell! Security!" Footsteps thundered in the hallway. "Sir, please listen," Shalom pleaded. "She was suffering for years, and no one was helping her." "You don't get to make that call," Matt roared. "You're the help. You clean floors. You don't perform medical procedures on children." Mrs. Caldwell appeared in the doorway, face pale. Behind her, the estate's security guard. "Call the police," Matt said. "I want her arrested." Shalom's blood turned to ice. "Mr. Bullock, assault, practicing medicine without a license, endangering a child. I want her charged with everything." "Daddy, no!" Julia's voice was small but audible. "No!" Everyone froze. Julia was looking at her father, tears streaming down her face, her small hands clutching his shirt. "Don't take her," Julia said haltingly. "She helped." Matt stared at his daughter like she was a ghost. "You can hear me," he whispered. "You can actually hear me." Julia nodded, then winced. Too loud. Matt's eyes filled with tears. "I'm sorry. I'm sorry." He adjusted his voice to barely above a whisper. "Is this better?" "Yes." He looked at Shalom then, really looked at her, and something in his expression cracked. But the fear remained. The anger, the terror of what could have gone wrong. "Julia could have been hurt," he said hoarsely. "She could have died." "But she didn't," Shalom said quietly. "She's hearing you. For the first time. She's hearing your voice." Matt's jaw worked. His hands trembled where they held Julia. "Sir," Mrs. Caldwell stepped forward. "What are your orders?" The room held its breath. Matt looked at his daughter, at the bead on the table, at Shalom, still kneeling on the floor where he'd pushed her. "Daddy," Julia whispered again, testing the word, marveling at it. "I can hear you." Matt's face broke. He pulled Julia close, buried his face in her hair, and for the first time in 7 years, he let himself cry in front of her, because she could finally hear him. The security guard shifted uncomfortably. Mrs. Caldwell waited. Shalom remained frozen, watching the father and daughter she'd brought together and destroyed at the same time. Finally, Matt lifted his head. His eyes were red, his voice wrecked. "Take her to the West Wing," he told security. "Lock the door. No one goes in or out until I decide what to do with her." "Sir," Shalom started. "Don't," Matt said sharply. "Don't say another word." Julia twisted in his arms, reaching for Shalom. "No, she stays." "Baby, she—" Matt's voice broke. "She could have hurt you." "She didn't. She helped. Please." But Matt shook his head. "Take her, now." The security guard stepped forward, gripped Shalom's arm. She didn't resist. What was the point? She'd done what she'd come to do. Julia could hear, and Shalom would pay the price. As the guard led her toward the door, she looked back one last time. Julia was crying again, reaching for her, calling her name, a name Julia had never been able to say out loud before. Shalom! The sound of it, the desperate, beautiful sound, followed Shalom down the hallway, followed her into the locked room, followed her into the darkness. And she prayed, not for rescue this time, but for Julia. That the girl would keep her voice, that Matt would see the truth, that somehow, impossibly, this would be enough, even if it cost Shalom everything. The West Wing room had no windows, just 4 walls, a narrow bed, and a door that locked from the outside. Shalom sat on the floor, back against the wall, knees drawn to her chest. She'd stopped crying an hour ago. Now there was just silence, and the knowledge that everything she'd feared had come to pass. She'd be arrested, deported. Her sister would lose her tuition. Her grandmother would lose her care. And for what? A child who could finally hear her father's voice. Shalom closed her eyes. Worth it, she thought. God help me. It was worth it. Footsteps in the hallway. The lock clicked. Mrs. Caldwell entered, face carved from stone. Mr. Bullock is taking Julia to the hospital for a proper examination. Shalom nodded, said nothing. He'll decide what to do with you when he returns. Is Julia okay? Mrs. Caldwell's expression flickered, just for a moment. She won't stop asking for you. Something in Shalom's chest broke and mended at the same time. Thank you for telling me. Mrs. Caldwell left without another word. The lock clicked again, and Shalom was alone. The hospital examination took 4 hours. Matt sat in the waiting room, Julia beside him, her small hand clutched in his. She'd been overwhelmed since they arrived. Every sound was too loud, too sharp. The fluorescent lights hummed. Phones rang. People's footsteps echoed. Julia pressed against her father's side, hands over her ears. I know, Matt whispered. I know it's a lot. She looked up at him, reading his lips, and nodded. Then she signed something, clumsily, uncertainly. Where is Shalom? Matt's jaw tightened. We'll talk about that later. Julia's face fell. Mr. Bullock? A doctor appeared in the doorway, young, competent-looking. Dr. Reyes, according to her badge. Matt stood, keeping Julia's hand in his. They followed Dr. Reyes into a consultation room lined with diplomas and anatomical charts. We've completed the examination, Dr. Reyes said, settling behind her desk. And I have to say, this is remarkable. What did you find? Your daughter's hearing loss was never congenital. Dr. Reyes pulled up images on her computer screen. There was a foreign object, what appears to have been a decorative bead, lodged deep in her right ear canal. Based on the tissue reaction and scar formation, it's been there for years, possibly since she was an infant. Matt's hands clenched. How is that possible? She's seen dozens of specialists. I reviewed the scans you provided from previous examinations. Dr. Reyes's voice grew quieter. The object was positioned in such a way that it wouldn't show up on standard tympanometry. And if no one was looking for an obstruction, if the assumption was already that her hearing loss was congenital, it would be easy to miss. Easy to miss, Matt repeated hollowly. I'm not excusing it, Dr. Reyes said quickly. I'm explaining it. Diagnostic bias is a real problem. Once a diagnosis is made, especially by a respected specialist, subsequent doctors often accept it without question. Matt felt sick. So all this time, your daughter has partial hearing in her right ear. Now that the obstruction is removed, With proper hearing aids and speech therapy, she could develop significant functional hearing. The room tilted. She was never fully deaf, Matt whispered. No, she wasn't. Julia tugged his sleeve. She'd been watching their lips, trying to follow. Matt knelt in front of her, his hands shaking. You can hear, he said softly. You were always supposed to hear. Julia nodded. Then her small hands moved. The doctors were wrong? Matt's throat closed. Yes, baby. They were wrong. Julia's next question was hesitant, scared. Was it my fault? No. The word came out fierce, broken. No, Julia. None of this was ever your fault. He pulled her close, felt her small body relax against him, and realized, with crushing clarity, how badly he'd failed her. Dr. Reyes cleared her throat gently. Mr. Bullock, I have to ask, who removed the object? Matt's grip on Julia tightened. A member of my household staff. Not a medical professional? No. That was incredibly risky. The ear canal is delicate. Improper removal could have caused permanent damage. I know, but it didn't. Dr. Reyes leaned forward. Whoever did this was extraordinarily careful. The canal shows minimal trauma. No infection. No perforation. Frankly, I've seen ENT specialists cause more damage during routine procedures. Matt looked up. What are you saying? I'm saying someone saved your daughter's hearing, possibly her life, if the obstruction had shifted and caused a severe infection. She paused. I don't know who this person is, but they deserve recognition, not punishment. Matt couldn't speak. Julia signed again. Shalom. Her name is Shalom. Back at the house, Matt went straight to his study. He pulled out every medical file he'd kept on Julia. 7 years of documentation, scans, reports, invoices. He spread them across his desk and started reading. Really reading. Not skimming, not trusting the summaries his assistant had prepared, actually reading the doctor's notes. And as the hours passed, a picture emerged that made his blood run cold. Miss Julia Bullock presents with apparent congenital hearing loss. Standard examination performed. No obvious abnormalities detected. Recommend acceptance and adaptation strategies. Follow-up examination. Previous diagnosis confirmed. Family advised to pursue sign language education and specialized schooling. Patient history consistent with profound congenital deafness. No further intervention recommended. The same words, over and over, in different handwriting, different letterheads, different cities, but always the same conclusion. Accept it. Adapt. Move on. No one had questioned. No one had looked deeper. And Matt, desperate, grieving, overwhelmed, had paid them all. He pulled out the invoices, $47,000 for a 3-day consultation in Switzerland, $83,000 for experimental testing in Tokyo, $126,000 for a specialist in London who'd spent 45 minutes with Julia. Hundreds of thousands of dollars. And not one of them had found a bead. Matt's hands began to shake. He'd thrown money at the problem because money was what he had. Money was what he understood. Money was supposed to fix everything, but all his money had done was enable lazy doctors to collect massive fees while failing his daughter. They'd seen his wealth and stopped trying. They'd seen his desperation and exploited it. And Julia had suffered for 7 years because he'd trusted the wrong people, because he'd been too ashamed to push harder, because he'd been more afraid of the world seeing his broken daughter than of actually helping her. Matt's vision blurred. He pushed back from the desk, stumbled to the window. Outside, the estate stretched in manicured perfection, every tree trimmed, every hedge shaped, every surface controlled. He'd built an empire on control, and lost his daughter in the process. "Sir," Mrs. Caldwell stood in the doorway. "What?" His voice was raw. "The staff is asking about the situation." "With Miss Shalom." Matt turned slowly. "What situation?" Mrs. Caldwell's expression tightened. "Whether you'll be pressing charges." "Charges? For what she did to Julia." Matt stared at her. At this woman he'd trusted to run his household. This woman who'd warned him, over and over, not to let staff get too attached to Julia. "What she did," Matt said slowly, "was save my daughter." Mrs. Caldwell's mouth thinned. "She had no right. She had every right." Matt's voice rose. "She saw my daughter in pain and did something about it. While the rest of us, while I—" He stopped, steadied himself. "Where is she?" "West Wing, as you ordered." "Is she hurt? Did security—" "She's unharmed." Matt moved toward the door. Mrs. Caldwell stepped aside. "Sir, what are your intentions?" He paused in the doorway. "To apologize," he said quietly, "and pray she forgives me." Then he was running, down the hallway, through the East Wing, past startled staff who'd never seen Matt Bullock move faster than a measured walk. He reached the West Wing door, fumbled with the lock. It opened. The room was dark. Shalom sat on the floor, exactly where Mrs. Caldwell had left her hours ago. She looked up as light spilled in. Her face was calm, resigned, ready for whatever came next. Matt's throat tightened. This woman, this stranger he'd barely noticed until 3 weeks ago, had done what he couldn't do. She'd loved his daughter enough to risk everything, and he'd locked her in a room like a criminal. "Shalom," he said hoarsely. "I'm sorry." She blinked, surprise flickering across her face. "I'm so sorry." He stepped into the room, knelt in front of her. "Julia is fine. Better than fine. The doctors said you saved her hearing, possibly her life." Shalom's eyes filled with tears. "And his voice broke. "I treated you like—" "It's okay," she whispered. "It's not okay." He shook his head. "Nothing about this is okay, but I need you to know." He looked at her directly. "You saw my daughter when I wouldn't. You helped her when I couldn't. And I will spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of what you did." Shalom's tears spilled over. "Is Julia? She wants to see you. She won't stop asking for you." Shalom's face crumpled with relief. Matt stood, offered his hand. She took it, and together they walked out of the darkness. Julia was waiting in the conservatory. She sat by the window, her new hearing aids, temporary ones from the hospital, visible behind her ears. Her hands were folded in her lap, but her eyes never left the doorway. When Shalom appeared, Julia's face transformed. She leaped up and ran, actually ran across the room. "Shalom!" The word was loud, uncontrolled, perfect. Shalom caught her, lifted her, held her like she'd never let go. Julia buried her face in Shalom's shoulder and sobbed, not silent tears, real audible crying. "I thought," Julia's words were muffled, "I thought he took you away." "I'm here," Shalom whispered. "I'm right here. Don't leave. Never." Matt stood in the doorway, watching. He'd seen his daughter cry 1,000 times. silent tears that rolled down her cheeks without sound. Grief he could ignore because he couldn't hear it. But this broke him, because now he could hear what he'd been doing to her all these years. Julia pulled back, wiped her eyes, and looked at Shalom's face. "Can you hear me?" she asked, her speech improving with each word. "Every word." "I sound funny." Shalom laughed through tears. "You sound beautiful." Julia smiled, then her expression grew serious. "My ears hurt. The sounds are too loud." "I know, but it gets better, I promise." "How do you know?" "Because I've seen it before." "You're so brave, Julia." Julia's eyes drifted to her father, still standing in the doorway. Her expression shifted, uncertain, guarded. "He's not angry anymore," Shalom said softly. Matt stepped forward slowly, like approaching a wounded animal. "Julia." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Can I talk to you?" Julia nodded, but moved closer to Shalom. Matt knelt on the floor in front of them. This man who commanded boardrooms, who made investors sweat with a single glance, who'd built an empire on the strength of never bowing to anyone. He knelt. "I need to say something," he began, "and I need you to hear it. Really hear it." Julia watched his lips carefully, her small hand gripping Shalom's. "I failed you," Matt said. "Not just today, not just this week. For 7 years, I failed you." Julia's eyes widened. "I was supposed to protect you, help you, love you the way you deserve to be loved. And instead," his voice cracked, "instead, I hid you. Because I was ashamed, not of you, never of you, but of myself." Tears spilled down his cheeks. "I couldn't fix you, and I thought that made me a failure. So I stopped trying. I stopped looking at you because every time I did, I saw everything I couldn't do." Julia's own eyes filled with tears. "But you were never broken," Matt whispered. "I was. And I made you pay for it." He looked at Shalom then, his face raw with grief. "This woman, Shalom, she saw you, really saw you. In 3 weeks, she did what I couldn't do in 7 years. She looked past the diagnosis everyone had given you and saw a child in pain." He turned back to Julia. "And she risked everything to help you. Her job, her safety, her freedom. Because she cared more about you than about protecting herself." Matt's voice dropped to almost nothing. "I should have been the one who did that. I should have been the one who looked closer, who asked harder questions, who loved you enough to risk being wrong." He reached out slowly, giving Julia time to pull away. She didn't. His hand cupped her small face. "I'm sorry, Julia. I'm so sorry." Julia stared at him for a long moment. Then she launched herself into his arms. Matt caught her, held her, and finally, let himself feel the weight of what he'd done, and what he'd almost lost. Over the next 3 days, the house transformed. The silence broke. Julia explored sound like a scientist discovering a new element. She tapped walls to hear the difference between plaster and wood. She turned faucets on and off, marveling at running water. She made Shalom repeat words over and over, learning to connect the shapes of lips with the sounds they made. "Bird," Shalom would say. "Bird," Julia repeated, her tongue working carefully. "Flower." Lower. "Julia. Julia." She paused. "That's me. "That's you." Julia grinned. "I like how it sounds." Matt watched from the doorway, afraid to intrude, afraid to break whatever magic was happening between them. But Shalom noticed. "Mr. Bullock," she called. "Come help." He entered hesitantly. "Sit," Shalom instructed. He sat. She placed a hand on his chest. "Say something. Let her feel your voice." Matt looked at his daughter. "What should I say?" Julia's face lit up. "Tell me about Mama." Matt's breath caught. He'd avoided talking about Catherine for so long. It hurt too much, reminded him too much of what he'd lost. But Julia was watching him with such hope, such hunger. "Your mother," he began slowly, "had the most beautiful laugh." Julia leaned forward, her hand on his chest, feeling the vibrations. When she laughed, everyone around her started laughing too, like joy was contagious. "What did she look like?" "Like you." Matt's voice softened. "She had your eyes, your smile, your stubborn chin." Julia touched her own chin. "Stubborn? Very." He smiled through tears. "She never gave up on anything. Or anyone." "Did she love me?" The question hit him like a physical blow. "So much," Matt whispered. "The last thing she said before." He stopped. "She said your name. She wanted to make sure you were safe." Julia's eyes filled with tears. "I wish I could have heard her." "Me too, baby. Me too." They sat together, father and daughter, mourning what they'd lost and discovering what they still had. And Shalom, watching from the corner, felt something settle in her chest. This was why she'd risked everything. For this. The staff meeting was called for Friday evening. Everyone gathered in the main parlor. Cook, gardener, driver, Mrs. Caldwell, and Shalom. Matt stood at the front of the room, Julia beside him. "I've called you here because I need to make something clear," he began. "Benedicta Shalom is no longer employed as household staff." Shalom's heart stopped. Mrs. Caldwell's expression was triumphant. "Effective immediately," Matt continued. "She is Julia's primary caregiver. She will live in the East Wing guest suite. She will have full authority over Julia's care, education, and well-being. And she will be compensated accordingly." Shalom's mouth fell open. "Furthermore," Matt said, his voice hardening, "anyone who has a problem with this arrangement can submit their resignation, effective immediately." Mrs. Caldwell's face drained of color. "Julia is not a secret to be managed," Matt continued. "She is my daughter, and it's time the world knew she existed." He looked at Shalom. "If you'll have us." Shalom's eyes filled with tears. "Yes, of course, yes." Julia grabbed her hand, squeezed tight. That evening, Matt sat in his study, staring at his laptop. The cursor blinked in an empty email. To Public Relations Team. Subject, Statement for Immediate Release. His fingers hovered over the keyboard. For 7 years, he'd hidden Julia, protected his reputation, maintained the illusion of control. But control had cost him everything that mattered. He began typing. "I want to introduce you to someone I should have introduced years ago. My daughter, Julia." His hands shook. Julia was diagnosed as deaf at 6 months old. I accepted that diagnosis without question. I hired the best doctors, sought the best treatments, and when nothing worked, I made a choice I will regret for the rest of my life. I hid her, not to protect her from the world, but to protect myself from shame. The words poured out. The failed diagnoses, the years of isolation, Shalom's intervention, the truth about the obstruction, and his failure. My wealth gave me access to the best medical care money could buy. But money cannot buy attention. It cannot buy humility. It cannot buy the courage to question assumptions. A member of my household staff, a woman with no medical training and every reason to stay silent, saw what dozens of specialists missed. She risked everything to help my daughter, and she succeeded where I failed. Julia can hear now, not perfectly, but enough. Enough to say my name. Enough to tell me she loves me. Enough to finally be seen. He paused, reread the draft, then hit send. The world would know, and Matt Bullock would finally face the consequences of his choices. But this time, he wouldn't face them alone. He had Julia, and against all odds, impossibly, he still had Shalom, the woman who had saved them both. The email went public on a Monday morning. By noon, it had been shared 40,000 times. By evening, news vans lined the gates of the Bullock estate. Matt watched from his study window as reporters gathered like vultures, cameras pointed at the house that had hidden his daughter for 7 years. He'd expected this: the scrutiny, the judgment, the headlines. Billionaire admits to hiding disabled daughter medical negligence or parental shame? The child the world never knew. He'd earned every word. But this time, he wouldn't hide. The press conference was scheduled for Wednesday. Matt stood at the podium, Julia beside him, Shalom just off camera. Julia wore her hearing aids openly, no hair styled to cover them, no shame. Just a 7-year-old girl holding her father's hand, facing a room full of strangers. "My name is Matthew Bullock," he began, "and this is my daughter, Julia." Cameras flashed. Julia squeezed his hand. He squeezed back. "I'm not here to defend my choices. I can't. For 7 years, I hid my daughter from public view because I was ashamed, not of her, but of what her diagnosis represented. My inability to fix something, my failure to control something, my weakness." His voice remained steady. "I hired the best doctors money could buy, and they all told me the same thing. Julia was profoundly deaf, congenitally, irreversibly. And I believed them. Not because the evidence was conclusive, but because it was easier than questioning them." A reporter raised her hand. Matt nodded. "Mr. Bullock, are you saying the medical professionals were negligent?" "I'm saying I was negligent. I paid for conclusions, not investigations. I wanted answers, not truth, and my daughter paid the price." Another hand. "What changed?" Matt looked at Shalom, standing in the shadows. A woman with no medical training, no credentials, and every reason to stay silent looked at my daughter and saw what I couldn't. She saw pain. She saw possibility. And she acted. He turned to Julia. "Would you like to say something?" Julia looked up at him, nervous. He knelt, bringing himself to her level. "You don't have to," he whispered. "But they should hear your voice." Julia nodded. She stepped forward, and the room fell silent. "My name is Julia," she said carefully. "I'm 7. I like to draw and read, and—" she paused. "And I can hear now." Her words were slow, deliberate, beautiful. "I couldn't before. There was something in my ear. Shalom found it. She helped me." Cameras clicked furiously. "My daddy didn't know," Julia continued. "The doctors didn't know. But Shalom looked, really looked." She glanced back at Shalom. "And now I can hear my daddy's voice, and birds, and rain, and everything." She smiled. "It's really loud sometimes, but I like it." The room erupted with questions, but Matt raised his hand. "One more thing," he said. "Effective immediately, I'm establishing the Julia Bullock Foundation. It will fund medical second opinions for children whose diagnoses have been accepted without question. It will provide resources for families who can't afford to challenge medical conclusions. And it will ensure that no child suffers in silence because the adults around them stopped looking." He paused. "Money didn't save my daughter. Attention did. And I intend to spend the rest of my life making sure other families learn that lesson faster than I did." The response was overwhelming. Donations flooded in. Medical professionals reached out. Families shared their own stories of missed diagnoses, dismissed concerns, children who'd suffered because someone stopped asking questions. Within a month, the foundation had helped 12 children. Within 6 months, over 200. And Julia became the face of second chances. Not because she was a billionaire's daughter, but because she'd been silenced and found her voice. Life in the Bullock house changed completely. The silence was replaced with sound. Julia's laughter echoed through hallways that had been tomb quiet for years. She played music, softly at first, then louder as she adjusted. She asked endless questions about sounds she'd never heard before. "What's that noise?" "The refrigerator." "Why does it hum?" "I have no idea." She giggled. "It sounds funny." Shalom moved into the East Wing suite, though she spent most of her time in Julia's room, reading to her, teaching her, helping her navigate this new, overwhelming world of sound. "Again," Julia would say after every story. "I want to hear it again." And Shalom would read it again. Matt watched them together and felt something he hadn't felt in 7 years. Hope. Mrs. Caldwell resigned quietly. "I did what I thought was right," she said stiffly. "So did I," Matt replied, "and we were both wrong." She left without another word. The new staff understood the rules. Julia was not a secret. She was not fragile. She was a child who deserved to be seen, heard, and loved without conditions. And the house slowly came alive. One evening, 3 months after the press conference, Matt found Julia in the conservatory. She sat by the piano, fingers pressing keys gently, listening to each note. "Do you like it?" he asked. She nodded. "It's pretty. Can you play?" "A little. Your mother taught me." Julia's eyes lit up. "Really? Really? Will you teach me?" Matt's throat tightened. "I'd love to." He sat beside her on the bench, positioned her small hands over the keys, and showed her a simple melody. C, D, I, E. Julia played it back, her face intense with concentration. "Good," Matt said softly. "Now try this." E, F, G, Julia repeated it, then combined them. C, D, E, C, E, F, G. She looked up at him, beaming. "I did it." "You did." She played it again and again, each time a little smoother. Matt watched her fingers move across the keys and felt something break inside him. Not with pain this time, with gratitude. "Julia," he said quietly. She looked up. "I love you. I should have said it more. I should have shown it better, but I want you to know." His voice cracked. "You are the best thing that ever happened to me." Julia's eyes filled with tears. She threw her arms around his neck. "I love you too, Daddy." And Matt, strong, controlled, unshakable Matt Bullock, broke down completely. He held his daughter and cried, not silently, not hidden, just openly, honestly, finally allowing himself to feel everything he'd buried for 7 years. Julia pulled back, her small hand touching his wet cheek. "Daddy?" Her voice was soft, awed. "I can hear you crying." Matt laughed through tears. "Yeah, baby." "You can." "It sounds sad." "It is sad, but it's also happy. Both at the same time." Julia tilted her head, considering this. "That's weird." "Yeah." He smiled. "It is?" She hugged him again, and they sat there in the conservatory where Julia had once built towers alone, surrounded now by the sound of their breathing, the hum of the house, the proof that silence could be broken. That night, after Julia was asleep, Matt found Shalom in the library. She was reading, curled up in the chair by the window. "Can I join you?" he asked. She nodded. He sat across from her, unsure how to start. "I wanted to thank you," he said finally, "properly, for everything you've done." "You already have." "Not enough." He leaned forward. "You saved my daughter. You saved me. And I don't know how to repay that." Shalom closed her book. "You don't need to repay it, Mr. Bullock. That's not why I did it." "I know, but still." "Do you know what Julia asked me yesterday?" Shalom interrupted gently. "She asked if I would stay, not as her caregiver, not as her teacher, just stay as family." Matt's chest tightened. "What did you say?" "I said yes." Shalom smiled. "If that's okay with you." "It's more than okay." His voice was rough. "You already are family. You have been since the day you refused to look away." They sat in comfortable silence. Finally, Shalom spoke. "You know what the real miracle is?" "What?" "It's not that Julia can hear now. It's that she was finally seen, really seen. Not as a diagnosis, not as a failure, just as a child who needed help." Matt nodded slowly. "I spent 7 years looking at her and never seeing her. You see her now. Because you taught me how." Shalom's eyes glistened. "We all get second chances, Mr. Bullock. The question is what we do with them." Matt smiled. "Call me Matt, please." "Okay, Matt." Upstairs, Julia slept peacefully. Her hearing aids sat on the nightstand, waiting for morning. But even in silence, she was different now. She'd been hidden, and now she was seen. She'd been silenced, and now she was heard. The Bullock estate no longer existed in silence. It existed in truth. And truth, messy, imperfect, beautiful truth, was so much louder than anything money could buy. 6 months later, a journalist asked Matt what he'd learned from everything that happened. He thought for a long time. "I learned that miracles don't come from wealth or power or control," he said finally. "They come from people who care enough to look when everyone else has stopped looking, who ask questions when everyone else has accepted answers, who risk everything for someone who can't risk anything for themselves." He paused. "My daughter can hear now, but the real miracle wasn't giving her sound. It was finally giving her what she'd needed all along." "What was that?" the journalist asked. Matt smiled. "Someone who saw her. Sometimes the miracle isn't hearing the world, it's finally being heard."